BFSLA webinar today. The topic for today is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand decision making. Is a governance board the best option for prudential regulation? Just at the outset, a couple of housekeeping matters. I will be presenting it with Helen Durbin. This presentation is based on an article that Helen and I wrote, mostly, to be fair to say, Helen wrote for the BFSLA Research Essay Prize. So that it's based on an article that hopefully will be published shortly. In terms of the mechanics of today's session, you should have an option of putting questions into a Q&A box into the webinar. If you can do that, what we would like to do is probably leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end to answer questions. If we can't get on to all of them and you have a burning question that you really wanted us to answer, then please feel free to email us afterwards and we will attempt to answer it then. Secondly, and for those who are aware of people who wanted to attend today's seminar and might not have been able to make it, I'm told it is being recorded, in fact recorded live, I think, on YouTube, but will be available on YouTube. There will not, however, be a Netflix version of it. So that's the broad logistics. In terms of the structure of the presentation today, Helen, first slide maybe. The scope of the presentation today is we're looking at what we think is best practice governance for a full service central bank, which is what the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is. That is slightly different from Australia, where they have separated prudential regulation and central banking, but we're looking at it in the New Zealand context. In terms of the structure of the presentation, the first part is I am going to do, and we're going to really sort of set the scene, the context for the discussion paper that we prepared. That will be looking at what a central bank does, then look at the history of the Reserve Bank since 1986 through to the 2017 IMF review. Helen will then deal with the next two bits, the dealing with inherent biases, and look at some of the literature in relation to best practice for regulators and how to deal with what all of us have, inherent biases, but particularly inherent biases that regulators might have. Helen will also then look at international comparators, predominantly Australia and the UK, and realistically predominantly the UK, as it probably has the best aligned comparison to New Zealand. And then lastly, what we think is best for New Zealand is something that will be shared between Helen and I, so we'll switch a bit between the two of us in terms of what we think the right answer is. And then, as I've mentioned, there will be questions at the end, so feel free as you go to type in questions and we will endeavour to answer those as we go. Slide clips. So starting with the role of central banks, they've been described as curious institutions. I think curious in the terms of inquisitive as opposed to strange. They're also being described as incredibly powerful institutions. And in that context, certainly from a global perspective, for much of the last 12 years, central banks have been really at the forefront of a lot of what's been happening in economic activity. Monetary policy and the role of central banks in economic crises are the things that make central bank governors famous and make them give them attention with politicians. And in that context, many of us will probably have heard of people like Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Christine Lagarde, Lord Mervyn King, Mark Carney. In New Zealand context, people like Adrian Orr and Alan Bollard. We probably know those central bank governors a lot better than we might know those involved in, say, Secretary of Treasury positions. Certainly, I'm not sure that Caroline McLeish, for example, is as well known as Adrian Orr at the moment, or that John Whitehead is as well remembered as Alan Bollard. So central bank governors and central banks, certainly, particularly in the last 12 years, but probably an awful lot longer than that, have been incredibly powerful institutions with incredibly influential senior executives and probably the most powerful unelected representative in most countries, New Zealand included. Looking at what central banks do, and I'm probably slightly different from what's on the slide there, but the first and foremost, and the one that probably makes central bank governors and central banks most critical is their involvement with monetary policy. And in that sense, and trying to sort of work on equivalent agencies, they're very much like a treasury, and probably just as important a government agent as treasury. Certainly at the moment, they are much more visible, for example, in New Zealand, as they start to look at things like, they've already looked at in the New Zealand context, quantitative easing, but we're now looking at a funding for lending program, potentially negative interest rates, potentially intervention in foreign exchange markets. So quite dramatic things which central banks and the New Zealand Central Bank is being required to do as part of its monetary policy mandate. So point one, I guess, is that they are incredibly influential, effectively government agencies. The second part of their role is, rather than this financial stability, is financial infrastructure. And in this context, reserve banks are like huge SOEs. They provide, for example, infrastructure. So the payments infrastructure, much like a power infrastructure, is provided by the central bank. So access into the New Zealand payment system and maintenance of the payment system is a central bank role. On top of that, they're printing companies. They print cash. Then when they get the cash back, they iron it and make sure it can be used in ATMs again. They're a distribution company because they distribute cash. They're a stock exchange. They run a much bigger exchange, settlement, security and clearing system than NZX in New Zealand, for example. NZ Clear, which holds most of the large debt securities, particularly things like government bonds and treasury bills, is managed and operated by the Reserve Bank. They are themselves a banker, a financial institution. They provide bank accounts to banks, but they also run open market operations where they buy and sell foreign currency. They intervene and buy and sell government bonds, so they have their own financial markets operations. So I guess point two, in terms of financial infrastructure, the Reserve Bank, in terms of its commercial operations, which I think actually account for about 2/3 of its budget, are actually huge and probably as big as any SOE. And then lastly, Reserve Banks are prudential supervisors, and it's the prudential supervision aspect of their role that we're going to focus on a little bit today. Slide perhaps, Ellen. And in that context, in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank prudentially regulates banks, non-bank deposit takers, insurance companies, securities and settlement systems, payment systems. So it has a wide range of critical parts of the financial infrastructure that it regulates on a day-to-day basis. Now, while New Zealand runs what's called a Twin Peaks model with two financial regulators being the FMA and the Reserve Bank, certainly in my view, the one peak being the Reserve Bank peak is much bigger than the other peak, the FMA peak, and they have more powers. To some extent, they're the FMA on steroids. They have an ability to set rules themselves, largely through conditions of registration, which have criminal consequences. They have an ability to bail out failed institutions through their lender of last resort function. And then also, slightly curiously, they regulate themselves as a provider of payment systems and security systems, which they own. They regulate themselves. They do this through a separate department, which does have some separation from other aspects, and they do try and make a conscious effort to separate their supervision from their policy, from their daily operations, from their monetary policy. But ultimately, all of the decisions end up with the governor as the single decision maker. So that's how the New Zealand Central Bank operates. Now, probably just the next slide, perhaps the context, the history of the Reserve Bank since 1986. And we picked 1986 because that was when the original 1964 Reserve Bank Act was amended. and was subsequently updated in 1989. Probably three key things that it's probably important to bear in mind when understanding the context in which that Act was passed. The first thing was it was a response to Rob Muldoon. It was a response to intervention by politicians and military policies, which by and large aligned to an electoral cycle. And it was a way of trying to avoid that occurring. They did it by effectively creating an emperor, a single decision maker governor who was able to make decisions. That the board that the Reserve Bank had was largely an advisory board, so all of the power, all of the decision-making rights sat with a single, all-powerful individual, which is why probably often regarded as perhaps the single most powerful unelected official. It's a model which has been copied in other places, although increasingly probably more in third world and developing economies. The second key thing to realise about the context of the Reserve Bank Act is that it was a key plank of Rogernomics. New Zealand was in an era in which we believed in light-handed regulation and free markets. And that was reflected in a very high-level approach and a very light-handed approach to prudential regulation, which occurred in the 1986 followed by 1989 Act. And the third key point in relation to that is that the first governor under the new Act realistically was Don Brash. Don Brash was governor for 14 years from 1988 to 2002 and largely set the way in which the Act was interpreted and applied in practice. Don Brash clearly must have been a disciple of Rogernomics because he ultimately became leader of the Act Party in about 2010, I think. As a result of all that, what New Zealand ended up with was a situation in which its central bank did no on-site supervision, unlike other central banks, an entire reliance on market and self-discipline. And for a period, and certainly in the heydays of the 90s and 1990s, no meaningful information was provided to the Reserve Bank that wasn't publicly available. The theory being if we don't have it, we can't know about it, we can't have any moral hazard, so we can't be blamed. So there was a very strong view in the middle of the 1990s that the Reserve Bank didn't want to get extra reports from banks because it would create moral hazard for the government. And then lastly, we had no deposit insurance, unlike most other countries. So moving along, and even though the next slide talks about the IMF review in 2017, I'm going to start with the IMF review in 2004. For the first time, in terms of that IMF review in 2004, there was a suggestion that maybe the emperor didn't have any clothes on. And the IMF expressed concerns around, firstly, non-banks, which turned out to be very prophetic, but particularly about the lack of micro-prudential regulation at an institutional level, and also the unconventional approach to supervision, which they described as more appropriate for developing and transitional economies. For all of that, however, even though by the time that review was done in 2004, we had a different governor, and this goes to some of the points that Helen will be making later, there was a resistance to any substantive change to the way in which we regulated or prudentially regulated. Fast forward to 2017, and then the IMF returned and were much more adamant in this instance that the emperor really did have no clothes when it came to prudential supervision. And in terms of the quote on the next page, thank you, Helen, I think is they said, otherwise market discipline in the banking industry has to be complemented by and often replaced by effective regulatory discipline. Again, 2017, we had a new governor. We also had a new deputy governor, and probably for the first time, there was an acceptance that maybe in relation to prudential supervision, the emperor had no clothes and it was time to do something about it. That has now prompted the review of the once-in-a-generation review of the Reserve Bank Act with the development of an institutional review, which does set out the governance approach, as well as a review of deposit-taking regulation. It is the The other thing that happened as part of the governance review, the first thing that happened was the creation of a monetary policy committee. So it was no longer just the Reserve Bank governance decision. There were other independent members added to that. But in relation to the other parts of its activities, its core commercial functions and its prudential regulation, the approach taken was to follow the FMA example and to have a governance board. So instead of what's effectively now an advisory board, a governance board to which the Reserve Bank governor would be accountable. So that's, I guess, the context of what I'll now hand over to Helen to deal with as to how New Zealand prudential regulation has operated for the last 30 years. Helen?
Thanks, Simon. I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, so I just thought I'd start with talking about some of the issues that exist and the challenges in policy making. So if we're looking at prudential regulation, what we know is that it's not an area where you can give specific targets to regulators like you can, say, with monetary policy. So very commonly, in terms of empowering a prudential regulator, what you'll see is that legislation puts in place quite broad statutory objectives. And what that means is that regulators have very wide discretion in policy formation. And within regulators, they will be unelected officials. And so that makes these institutions immensely powerful because they have the ability basically to affect the way that banks operate and to affect the lives of, certainly all depositors in banks. What we know from past experience and past financial crises is that where you have regulators undertaking decision making, there is always a risk that regulatory thinking will become rigid within the institution. And it can also become dominated by a small group of often long-serving bureaucrats and technocrats. And I think it's true to say that that's especially sort of an issue in small jurisdictions like New Zealand, where we have small populations. So what you can get is a small group who may have quite strong opinions or beliefs in the way that regulation should happen. What we also know, simply because we're all, we're human, is that we are all subject to cognitive biases, and that's irrelevant of how conscientious we might be in our jobs and how talented and clever we might be. So the common cognitive biases that are recognised in relation to policy making are preference bias, myopia, hubris, and confirmation bias. And its collective counterpart groupthink. And what we know is that if these biases operate, they can lead to defective policy making, misdirected or inadequate regulation and policies, and they can play out into practices, into how regulators operate. Now, we don't often, well, in times of calm sort of financial times, in terms of looking at what regulators do, commonly there'll be commentary from perhaps market participants. They may disagree with the way a policy is operating. You'll get media commentary on issues as they arise. You may get academic sort of criticism or analysis of particular policies. But commonly in calm times, regulators just tend to go along sort of doing what they're doing. And it's not often that we critically analyse in terms of looking at how cognitive biases might have affected policy making. And often that only takes place when there is some sort of financial crisis, when something terrible happens in our market and the government decides that it's going to, has to work out what went wrong and identify issues and basically face them and try and work out how to fix them. So what Simon and I have said here is that where you have a regulatory form of regulatory thinking or a philosophy that's been in place for a long time, it's actually very difficult to change that because regulators have very broad objectives, and often that will take a political will and a sort of a change in direction that is put in place through legislative changes. So just an example of that, we know from the GFC, there's been a lot of commentary on how groupthink affected regulation before the GFC, and certainly in the UK after the GFC, there was a recognition that one of the things that went wrong with regulatory thinking was that there was groupthink in play. And when George Osborne, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, was giving evidence in relation to the GFC and changing the UK's form of regulation, he basically acknowledged that it was Parliament, or part of Parliament's role, to challenge groupthink and to make sure that there were mechanisms in place in the financial regulatory framework to basically acknowledge that that cognitive biases exist and to attempt to lean against them. So if we just sort of move on now and just have a look at what other jurisdictions do. So what we know, in New Zealand, we adopted this Twin Peaks model. And actually what I'd say is that we did it in a fairly unsystematic way. In fact, it's difficult to actually even pinpoint the date that we adopted it. Some people say it was adopted in 2007. Others might suggest it was adopted in 2010. But really the whole way we went about it was to some extent haphazard. So if we look at the approaches that were taken to introducing the model, in relation to our first peak regulator, the Financial Markets Authority, I think New Zealand did a very good job with that. We had wholesale legislative reform, we established a new regulator, and there has been, regular reviews of how the regulator is operating. But when we turn and have a look at prudential regulation, we took an entirely different approach. We made piecemeal changes. There were new policies that were put in place, there were new memoranda of understanding that were put in place, but really we didn't change or look, I don't think, very deeply into whether we needed a separate prudential regulator, or actually we didn't really look into how decision making was undertaken within the Reserve Bank. So we had the sort of issues that really weren't addressed in terms of adapting our legislation to how the Twin Peaks model can be best used. So that's left us, really now with this review with an opportunity to reform our legislation and make it fit in much better with the Twin Peaks model. So I think part sort of underlying the Twin Peaks model really is the idea that actually in relation to regulation, what you really want are experts who have the dedicated and relevant expertise and experience making decisions. So, you've got, that's the first sort of important thing with Twin Peaks, you get the right people making the decisions. The second thing with Twin Peaks that's important is really to think about how a prudential regulator is going to undertake their task. What other tasks do they have to do? And one of the real issues with Twin Peaks is saying, well, what do you do with monetary policy and prudential regulation where they are undertaken by one regulator? Because that can create difficulties, and what we know from past experience is that where those two responsibilities are housed within the same regulator, what tends to happen is that monetary policy becomes sort of prioritized. And I think actually in terms of New Zealand, because we were so, we were at the forefront in removing political involvement in monetary policy, I think that's always been sort of a very important thing for New Zealand. And if you look at the reforms to put the Twin Peaks model in place, you can make a pretty good argument that when they were making those adjustments after the GFC, actually they were continuing to prioritize monetary policy. And so there was no real full reform process undertaken as there was you know, as with market conduct. So those two things you need to think about: have you got the expertise there, and what do you do about balancing monetary policy and prudential regulation? So if we turn first of all and look very briefly at Australia, they obviously put their Twin Peaks model in place in 1998 after the Wallace inquiry. And so what they've done is created a dedicated specialist regulator, which has a single-minded focus on prudential regulation. And they have removed monetary policy, or monetary policy remained with the Reserve Bank. So that's sort of a fairly, I would say, straightforward, you know, a basic approach to it. And APRA, I would say, has certainly come through relatively well through the Royal Commission. And really the model, I know there's some academic sort of adjustments that people think might be helpful, but actually it appears to have operated fairly well, certainly through the GFC. So if we turn now and have a look at the UK model, that's, I think, quite helpful for us now in New Zealand, looking at what they did. So really, once the GFC hit in the UK, there was a real attempt made to work out what had gone wrong with the regulatory model that they had in place and what they should do about it. So I'm sure a lot of you will remember that in the UK at the time, they had a super regulator model where they had the Financial Services Authority, which was undertaking both market conduct and prudential regulation. Now, in the reviews after the GFC, they basically identified three big problems with their regulatory model. So first of all, there was an underemphasis of prudential regulation against market conduct. Secondly, there was obviously insufficient macro-prudential oversight. And thirdly, there was overly light prudential supervision. So when they were looking to revise the model, they looked at what they thought were the important things to have within a regulator, and they really identified three things. So the first thing they was really the government and Treasury said they wanted was judgment-led, focused, effective regulation. So to catch issues, the ability to catch issues, if you can, as they arise. Secondly, they wanted to focus on expertise in technical matters. So there was an identification or a process where they looked at exactly what you needed in relation to different types of regulation and the specific expertise you needed sort of making decisions. And the third thing they wanted was to lean against cognitive biases. And one of the biases they recognized specifically was groupthink. And they, you know, the idea was to move regulation, you know, deconstruct the Financial Services Authority, create a new market conduct authority, and move prudential regulation back into the Bank of England. But there was a real awareness that there had been groupthink within the Bank of England in the past, and so they had to put mechanisms, institutional mechanisms, in place to try and protect that happening in the future. So the UK created this entirely new regime, and I'll go through it fairly briefly, but underneath this regime is a very detailed framework on the way basically committees work and how they interact between each other. So the first point in relation to the fact that monetary policy was going to be put into the sort of under the aegis of the Bank of England, so housed in the same institution, there was an awareness that they needed to make sure that these two things were treated equally. And so what they decided to do was to create separate statutory committees. And in fact, they've created three: of the Monetary Policy Committee, obviously for monetary policy, and then two committees for prudential regulation, the Financial Policy Committee, which looks after macro-prudential regulation, and the Prudential Regulation Committee that looks after micro-prudential regulation. So in terms of the measures that were embedded into the system to lean against cognitive biases. Andy Haldane of the Bank of England has spoken about this and written about this. So this is the way he's basically described the institutional measures. So in identifying those 4 biases I mentioned first, in relation to preference bias, which is where decision makers' preferences are what they believe should, the rules that should be put in place, to make sure they align with society's wishes, you put in place clear statutory objectives, and also in UK they have policy reports that are subject to parliamentary oversight and other mechanisms that create more transparency within the regulator. So things like financial stability indicators, risk standards, all being made transparent. In relation to myopia bias, where you have a decision maker that acts in accordance with what they want in the present, so short-termism, they put in independent statutory committees with with members who have expertise and experience, so technocrats for prudential regulation. And the statutory committee ensures that the committee can undertake policy making separate from the political process. So they have instrumental independence where there is a policy responsibility delegated to them. So the third cognitive bias, hubris, is where a decision maker is overconfident or overstates their performance. They put in place independent statutory committees together with external membership, and quite extensive external membership on those committees. And the idea is you have members drawn from inside the regulator, so here the Bank of England, and outside. And having that mix will help sort of dilute the influence of perhaps particularly powerful senior officials within the regulator. So the fourth cognitive bias, confirmation bias, which is the tendency to process information consistently with our own beliefs, and groupthink, its collective counterpart, is again met or leaned against by having independent statutory committees with external membership, but also by having each member individually accountable, having the chair vote last in meetings, and also making sure that your external members have actual relevant experience to the committee's mandate. So if we have a look in a bit more detail at how the framework works, in terms of preference bias, both these committees, the Financial Policy Committee and the Prudential Regulatory Committee, have idiosyncratic objectives and responsibilities. Now, the Financial Policy Committee, which has responsibility for macro prudential regulation, basically its objectives are to support the Bank of England in an overarching financial stability objective. The Prudential Regulation Committee, its objective is basically directed towards the promotion of safety and soundness of firms. And then there are quite complicated or complex statutory provisions underneath those objectives, which operate to ensure that the financial stability objective remains the predominant sort of objective in prudential regulation. So the Financial Policy Committee has recommendation powers and also direction powers that it can operate in relation to both the Financial Conduct Authority, the Market Conduct Regulator, and the Prudential Regulation Committee. And if we look just at the individual committees, what the UK has done is set up idiosyncratic membership structures for each committee. So for the Financial Policy Committee, while there are 13 members, one's non-voting, and you've got this equal balance between Bank of England staff and independent members. Of those independent members, there are really two groups. So there will be independent members who are outside the Bank of England, but not external members. So external members are defined in the statute to, well, they cannot be ministers of the Crown, employed in government departments where they're paid by Parliament, or external members of the other committee. So the idea is to really get people that are outside sort of that, that sort of framework. Similarly, with the Prudential Regulation Committee, you've got 12 members. And in fact, in relation to micro-prudential regulation, the majority the majority on the committee is of independent members, of which 6 must be external. So that gives you quite extensive sort of input from people other than officials that are working within the regulator. The other thing that I think is really interesting about the UK model is that they want particular types of expertise that are relevant to a particular committee's remit. So these descriptions of that are set out on the slide come from candidate briefs that were prepared by Her Majesty's Treasury and the Bank of England when they were looking recruiting, for external members for these committees. I won't read through all the details, but what you'll see is there's a slightly different emphasis on who they want. So if we look at prudential regulation, there was an emphasis on actually you could have somebody in business, financial markets, or law. So if you think about what happens in prudential regulation and micro-prudential regulation, when we're regulating, we actually have a joint economics law approach to it. So micro-prudential regulation will have a quantitative element. By that, I mean you'll have things like capital ratios, you'll have liquidity ratios and that sort of thing, which are often, to be honest, for the economists amongst us. But you also have qualitative regulations, so things like legal duties. So at the level of sort of micro-prudential level, you have this balance. And in fact, to some extent, we could say that we're looking at, with things like the BEAR, or it's now the FAR regime in Australia, or the senior managers regime in the UK, we're leaning slightly more, or doing a bit more qualitative type of regulation, because we're looking at introducing duties or more duties on different people within financial institutions. So just going back to the original point I was making, what is really interesting about this UK model is that they're really looking to hone in on, relevant experience, to have the right people, or as good people as they can, making judgments on what's right within their regulatory system. So if I just roll on a bit now and just have a look at New Zealand, Simon has spoken a bit about, New Zealand's sort of unusual approach to prudential regulation, and it's been unusual really for 30 years. So even when we made our changes in '86, we adopted a sort of a market-based or neoliberal approach that was really to the extreme of what other people were doing. So in 1980, a lot of this came out of work from a committee known as the Knight Committee, and when it devised sort of the regulatory philosophy, and one of the philosophies it devised was that regulation should interfere as little as possible, so be minimalistic. It should have nothing, it should not involve depositor protection, and it should really only be there to protect in case the system was going to implode completely. So protect payments, protect public confidence, but not get down into the nitty-gritty of prudential regulation, like overseeing individual firms or looking after depositors. Well, at the same time as we were deciding to do that, to not look after depositors, the UK was going in the opposite direction. It was putting it's put its first, I think, deposit insurance scheme in place in about 1982. So we were very unusual. And I think the other thing that's sort of quite surprising about New Zealand is that a lot of the strands of that original philosophy have endured for a very long time, and have even endured after the GFC, when other countries were saying, well, actually, we regulated too lightly and we didn't get things right, and intensified a lot of their supervision. New Zealand intensified part of it. We put in place a macro-prudential framework, but in terms of micro-prudential regulation, we really didn't change things as much as other countries did. And to that extent, the regulatory philosophy from the early 1980s was still resonating, in my view. So if we look at whether there has been, whether cognitive biases have been at play in New Zealand, we think that actually you can look at a couple of the approaches of the Reserve Bank and say, yes, you know, there's a very good argument that groupthink might have been operating or hubris might have been operating. So the first thing we've identified is this, the Reserve Bank's perception of the need for depositor protection and depositor insurance, and really this level that's appropriate for New Zealand. You know, while there's been, you know, as I say, the UK was putting depositor protection in place in 1982. Australia had depositor protection rules from 1945 and deposit insurance from 2008. Obviously, the US had deposit insurance from the Depression. We've really, you know, the approach of New Zealand in rejecting deposit insurance has been quite unusual, particularly post-GFC, and it's really only in 2019 that there has been a recognition that that might be a necessary part of our financial safety net. The second thing I think where you could argue that groupthink might have been operating is in the Reserve Bank's emphasis or belief in the effectiveness of market discipline as a mechanism to positively regulate markets. I think we know, certainly we know from the, in part from the GFC, that actually market discipline is a highly complicated mechanism, and it can operate positively or negatively, and various factors actually complicate the effect of market discipline. So it is actually, it's difficult to say that it will actually operate simply by imposing losses on creditors. I think that's quite a blunt approach to take to it. And there's certainly writing to suggest that, in fact, the way market discipline operates is far more nuanced than that. And you can't just say market discipline will operate positively if we impose losses on creditors. So just moving on to have to hubris, or sort of overconfidence, or overconfident belief in you know, in yourself and your own views. I think that, you know, you can actually look at a few situations where you can argue that the Reserve Bank might have been showing hubris. So, for example, the perception of the effectiveness of prudential minimalism, right back in the, you know, in the early 1980s, there was this absolutely fervent belief that's represented in the Reserve Bank writing, that the way that it saw regulation operating, this minimalist approach, would actually work, and that markets, you know, banks didn't need prudential standards because they'd actually develop their own, or banks and financial institutions didn't need it. The market would operate so that these institutions themselves would evolve standards. So obviously that actually that appeared misguided relatively shortly after the scheme was put in place, because what we know in New Zealand is that in the late 80s and the early 90s, we had sort of a slew of problems with financial institutions, DFC, Bank of New Zealand, Countrywide. So actually some adjustments had to be made to that system quite quickly. And so some changes were made in the 1989 Act. So a second suggestion we have of possible hubris is basically the reforms that were put in place in 1996 and the director attestation regime. So what we know there is that in New Zealand we created this disclosure regime, and we reduced prudential standards. So John Singleton has described that as, or described New Zealand as seeing disclosure and supervision as alternatives, pick one or the other, whereas most other jurisdictions saw disclosure and supervision as complementary and working together. So again, it was, you know, Don Brash was governor at the time. It was it's quite a neoliberal approach to regulation, and he actually was a enthusiastic proponent of this approach and vaunted it really internationally, suggesting that policymakers in other countries might reassess their conventional models of supervision, so limiting depositor protection, reducing the extent of prudential regulation and lessening the intensity of supervision. And of course that has proved misguided, certainly in the GFC, when we found that actually even the conventional forms of regulation we had in place at the time were wrong, and the idea that markets would fix everything has effectively been discredited. So the last suggestion of hubris is perhaps before the 2004 IMF review. In the early 2000s, there was a review of monetary policy, and in some of the documents supporting or dealing with that review of monetary policy, there was a statement made by the Reserve Bank that actually the need for New Zealand to reassess its financial regulation on both sides, market conduct and prudential regulation, was really weaker than for most other countries. And of course, that has proved misguided, certainly in 2004, but certainly as a result of what happened in the GFC. So from this, what I'm saying is actually, you know, no regulator is immune from cognitive biases. Certainly, we can see evidence of them in, or certainly you can argue they exist in the Reserve Bank. And actually, it's for our government to really face that fact and make sure that we have mechanisms in our prudential regulatory regime that will lean against them. So if we look at what we've got at the moment, the current proposal is this governance board of between 5 and 9 members, fully non-executive, responsible for all decision-making except monetary policy. And if you look at that, I mean, I know it's early days with the model, but actually, I would say that this model does neither provide sufficient leaning against cognitive biases, nor does it actually ensure that the requisite technical expertise will be in place on the board to understand in a deep way the technical issues that arise in prudential regulation and either defend or attack prudential policy. So it's really just, it's a generalist model, and for that reason I actually just think it's defective. There has been some sort of virtue made of the fact that actually it's similar to the structure for the Financial Markets Act, but actually I don't see any virtue in that at all. There's no reason why the model should be the same, because actually their functions are very different. And if you look at the UK, they have entirely different governance models between the Financial Conduct Authority, which is a company limited by guarantee. It's got a board made up of a majority of non-executives, but you have your prudential regulator, Bank of England, with actually quite a complicated and very different structure. So what we need to think about is what's right for our central bank. How do we get really good decision making for New Zealanders? So I'm going to hand over to Simon now. Simon, would you like to comment on the diverse Reserve Bank responsibilities?
Look, thanks, Helen. Look, I think what I might do is go reasonably quickly through the next few slides so that we've got a bit of time for questions at the end. But starting with is the governance board the right decision-making model for the RBNZ? As Helen said, that's not our view. And probably in that context, go back to what I said at the outset, is if you divide the Reserve Bank into 3 core business elements, and you start with the Monetary Policy Committee, what they've done with the Monetary Policy Committee is actually what we would say they should do with the Prudential Supervision Committee. They've looked at what the needs of that committee are and what skill sets are required for it. So it has 3 very senior economists on it, one of whom, Peter Harris, has a background in the labour markets, and given they now have an objective not just of inflation targeting but also ensuring full employment, they've managed to get a mix, the right mix, 3 senior economists, 2 professors along with Peter Harris, who have the skill set to achieve the objectives in the Act. So we would say, look, in terms of a model, tick for that part of it. But then you get into the next part of it and you say, well, if you look at the nature of the business operations that are run by the Reserve Bank, right now, running a payment system and a security clearing system, you'd be particularly concerned about things like cyber risk. NZX had a big denial of service attack recently. you would be wanting people on your board who were focused on what you need to do to ensure that the New Zealand payment system doesn't grind to a halt, because you've actually got people with the right expertise and the right focus on those things. You're also looking at things like digital cash, replacing other cash, and then just the basic risk management skills that you would need to run a business, which is effectively a financial markets banking institution. The skill sets for that, we say, very different from prudential supervision. And indeed, in performing those roles, the broad sort of Companies Act test, which is what those people are sort of really acting almost as directors of an SOE, is a different skill set from someone who is acting as a regulator. I mean, to start with, things like the conflict of interest rules are different from the bias rules that apply when you are acting as a regulator. And it's very difficult to switch, in our view, between the two roles. So if I'm sitting as a practical level as a Reserve Bank board director, and I've got stuff on monetary policy and economics at the top of my agenda, then I've got a whole lot of other stuff dealing with cyber risk and the resilience of the payment system, which has just been changed, as well as reports on how they're implementing quantitative easing and what's happening to their balance sheet as a result. And then at the end, looking at the bits that in relation to prudential supervision. The skill sets are just completely different. So I argue that, in fact, what you really need is a specialist prudential supervision board and again, if you adopt the approach that they've done with the monetary policy and look at what our strategy is and what we're trying to achieve, then you turn around and say, okay, well, this is what we're trying to achieve through prudential supervision, and these are the skill sets that we need in order to achieve it. On top of that, as Helen's pointed out, you've got, and look, entirely understandably, but a huge amount of institutional thinking that has developed over 30 years, and you're asking people in a regulator to fundamentally do, in many cases, do things which are completely different and a completely different philosophy from that which they've had for 20 or 30 years. So their own biases, their own preferences, you're saying, you've long held a belief that you should have a hands-off approach to supervision. Now we're going to make you supervise in a more conventional manner. There are challenges in making those cultural changes. Now, you might say good leadership can achieve that, and to some extent it can. But right now, when you look at the sort of challenges faced by the governor and the senior leadership team of the Reserve Bank and doing things that have never been done before, moving interest rates negative, quantitative easing, those things are going to have to take priority, and they will naturally take priority, which means that there is a real risk that prudential supervision will not be as effectively managed and changed as it could be or should be. So ultimately, our view is that we need to follow something that's much closer to a UK model. We need to recognise that there are three very different components to what the Reserve Bank does. And monetary policy, by and large, I think works, they've done the right thing. Managing their commercial operations and prudential supervision need to be separated. It's a completely different skill set as to how you do each of those things, and they need the same kind of focus that you might get through even a board subcommittee. But that having a board do that job and arguing that it's because it works for the FMA means it would work for the Reserve Bank is, in our view, wrong, because the regulators have completely different scope of activities. So, look, that's the conclusion of where we think things should go. I don't know, Helen, if you want to add any final comments to that before we see whether we can answer any questions to answer.
I'll just make one comment, and that is that if you look at the types of people that are identified as being sort of appropriate for the proposed governance board, the requirements are actually very generalised, and it would be possible to have a board, with nobody who has specialty in prudential regulation and supervision. If you look at what they are for the current board, they're actually quite similar. Again, the current board requirements are quite generalised. And, we know that there has been quite a lot of criticism over the years of the Reserve Bank board in terms of its oversight. And I think you can question, its effectiveness in terms of prudential regulation. But that board suffered from exactly the same, I would say, problems as the current proposal, in that the requirements are very generalised, and you could have, I haven't looked at the Reserve Board membership over 30 years, but there could have been phases where you had nobody who had expertise in prudential regulation and supervision. And what we can say about the oversight of the board over 30 years is that the Reserve Bank has been able to pursue an unconventional approach to prudential regulation and supervision for 30 years, and New Zealand does not have a complete financial safety net. So I think that's quite, for me, that's quite telling.
Thank you. Helen, do we have any questions that we...
We don't have any questions at the moment, Simon.
Okay, well, look, we're almost at time anyway, so we can give people 3 or 4 minutes of their life back. So thank you, everybody. If anybody does have any questions that they want to ask us afterwards, then please feel free to email us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.